Hi, everyone. Today, it's my great pleasure to have with me Professor Deanna Shemek, who's Professor of Italian in the Department of European Languages and Studies in the School of Humanities. So welcome, Deanna.
Thank you. Hi, Annalisa. It's nice to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you for accepting my invitation. And Deanna was already a guest in the first series of Cooking with the Professor virtually that we did about a year ago. So welcome back.
Thank you. It's fun to do these.
But this time you'll be on your own, not with Tyrus, who's, as you will know, the Dean of the School of Humanities. And so, Deanna, what recipe did you pick for this episode?
Okay, so I picked a recipe for biscotti because they're everywhere and they're very easy to make. And I thought both faculty and staff and students might find it fun to just have another biscotto recipe. And I took the opportunity to talk about two different cookbooks, two different cooking authors, one of whom is the author of this biscotto recipe. So just thought I'd do a little plug for Italian cookbooks.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit more about these cookbooks and their authors and why you put them.
Sure. So what I really wanted to talk about, because you and I have had these conversations a little bit, is Pellegrino Artusi's cookbook, The Science in the Kitchen and the Art of Eating, which is the first Italian cookbook to have been published in unified Italy. And it's a very special book in the hearts of so many Italians and so many cooks who love Italian food. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit, and I make a little presentation about that book. And then the other book is the book that I actually took the recipe from, because Artoozi, he has some biscotti recipes in there, but I chose to make a different one and put these two authors in conversation. So the other author is Michele Ciccolone, who is an Italian-American who has written 30-some cookbooks. Mm-hmm. And as I explain later, she actually wrote a foreword, a little introduction to the English language edition of Artusi's book. So just thought that would be fun. And so my biscotti are chocolate-cherry biscotti.
Wow.
Yeah, it's kind of unusual. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for picking Artoozi. As you said, Artoozi plays a vital, crucial role in Italian cooking, but also I would say in Italian culture more generally, because since he published this book in, I think, 1891, so about 30 years after the unification of Italy, the book has been a bestseller worldwide, and still to these days, it's one of those books that are likely to be present almost in every Italian household.
Yeah. And
he has definitely played the role of establishing Italian cooking in a sense, because he collected all these recipes from different regions, put them together, tested the recipes, and after all, he wanted to write, and he did write a book that, not by chance, is called The Science of Cooking or in the Kitchen. So there's a lot of research that goes into that book. So do you want to say anything about the book itself and how you came across it? And
yeah, sure. So I came across Artoozi because a dear friend, an older colleague, gave the book to me. And when he came to dinner one evening at our house, and that was decades ago, but that was my introduction to Artoozi, and I just dove into it. I loved Artuuzi's language, the way that he approaches his recipes, and as I say in my presentation, he's very chatty and very modest. He's kind of trying to give people the courage to make food. Something I had not really remembered is that Artoozi is from Emilia-Romagna, and so some people have criticized the book because they say this doesn't look like the Mediterranean Italian food that they recognize, or it has recipes in it that include butter and cream and some of those northern ingredients. But really, that's Italian too. And the book really does have this wonderful span. Because he had trouble publishing it, nobody wanted to publish it. He had to self-publish. And the book also has in it these little other elements that sort of reflect the difficulty. He has an introduction in which he talks about how nobody wanted to publish it. And then he adds these letters and compliments in that he got from important people, praising the book and saying how important it is to write about food and to share food. And so clearly, he won the day, as you were saying.
Yes.
Many, many copies, many editions of Artuzi. And he's one of those, I think Artuzi is one of those authors who can go by just one name. He's like a product or something, an Artuzi moment, an Artuzi, recipe or something. Everybody knows what that is because the book is just so foundational.
Yeah. You mentioned that Artuzi was originally from Emilia-Romagna, and that's absolutely true. In fact, he was born in Fornipopoli, which is a very small town near Forlì, which is itself not too far away from Bologna. And he also lived for quite a while in Bertinoro, which is even a smaller place, still in the same area. And actually, my mother and my family from my mother's side comes exactly from the same place.
Fornipopoli.
Fornipopoli and Bertinoro. Bertinoro was besieged by the Passatore at some point. It's an interesting little town in Italy, which not many people, of course, would know outside Italy, but it has a complicated history, and Romagna more generally, which is the part of Emilia-Romagna that is closer to the Adriatic coast, and that traditionally in history was under the Pope's influence, back in the days, pre the unification of Italy, is interestingly different from the rest of the same region called Emilia, where Bologna is, and obviously Bologna is better known worldwide, especially for the university and the food. But it's a part of Italy I'm very fond of because of my maternal family, and actually I always go back there whenever I go back to Italy because I still have family, and it's a very pleasant place. It's much sunnier than Bologna and Emilia, closer to the to the coast, and people are very very charming, very open, very friendly, full of life. They are a bit like the I don't know, these are stereotypes, but they have an approach to life which resembles a little bit more the approach that people from the south of Italy typically have. Again, these are all stereotypes, but maybe like all stereotypes, there are some elements that...
They don't come from nowhere. I've never been to Fornipopoli, but I have heard of it because Goldoni's play, the 18th century comedy La Locandiera, which in English is called Mirandolina, is about a very clever maid. One of the characters in there is the Count of Fornipopoli. and I always thought Goldoni chose that name because of the sound of the name. It's just so wonderful with all those syllables.
And there is a little of, not even a town, I guess, that has a wonderful name nearby called Premi il cuore, push the heart, press the heart.
Wow.
Wonderful names. It always makes me laugh, this name, Premi il cuore.
It sounds like a good place to send a love letter from.
Yes. Love letters from Premi il cuore. Yeah, so definitely, I think that whenever I read Artoozi, not so much the description of the recipes, but all the apparatus, like, you know, the introductions, the stories that it tells about the recipes or the people in the region where the recipe comes from. I always find it very familiar. I find myself at home because there's this kind of cordial way of talking about not just about the food, but about the people and the, let's say, the culture around it. And so I have a special bond to Artoozi, not only because of its relevance for cooking, but because it makes me feel at home. And being an expat, I sometimes like to have this feeling of belonging. What do you think is not nowadays, since the book was written 150 over years ago, what do you think may not be that appealing to the contemporary reader?
Mm-hmm.
Chance of
that's interesting. That's an interesting question, and I think I don't know for sure, but you know, today people are very precise about what they will and won't eat, and people have dietary restrictions. And Artuzi is very much against this. You know, he has these long kind of bits of advice and descriptions of how you should have your children eat all kinds of food, which is often common advice, have children try all kinds of different food. But he's really negative about people who have some dietary restrictions. And in fact, he even includes a little, I don't know if this is in the first edition, maybe not, but it's in the edition that I have. There's a little comic sketch that is a conversation between a host who's inviting a bunch of people over for dinner and his cook. And the host says, well, this person can't eat that, and that person can't eat this, and this person doesn't eat that. It's very much like trying to do a dinner party in today in California, you know, who has which allergies. We just know a lot more about food. He is completely, oblivious to all of this, and the sketch ends in a kind of humorous way. So I think that's one thing, and it's very interesting to hear him, to read him talking about when to have wine, for example.
Exactly.
You know, you could have
any time of day and night, apparently would do, right?
Now, people might like that or not like that. Maybe they would view that today as giving them permission, you know, to have, what was that, all day wine, whatever that thing is, you know, there's that phrase that people use. Rosé all day, that's it. But that's not really what he's talking about. He's really talking about a very kind of almost medicinal approach to wine. And that is very Italian, I think, not that they're medicinal, because wine is also about pleasure and taste and good company, but there is a sense of measure and a sense of timing and a lack of excess that is very typical, I think, of the way wine figures into Italian food culture. And so that's kind of a nice thing. But I think some of his rigors about, you know, his advice about the rhythms of the day, that, well, whether we like them or not, they just wouldn't work very well. You know, the pranzo, the lunch in the middle of the day, which should be the principal meal, is very unlikely to be incorporated into people's lives. And that even Italians don't really like that, because they don't get to take 2 hours or 3 hours off in the middle of the day and then go back and work until early evening, which was, I don't need to tell you, the norm, the regular rhythm of the business day in the Mediterranean.
Absolutely. You know, even for my parents' generation, it was really like that. My father has been a lawyer throughout all his life, so he had his own company, and no firm would come home in the middle of the day around 1 o'clock. You know, everything is a bit happens a little bit later in Italy. Right. So he would come home around 1 and then have a lunch and then have a siesta and then go back to his firm around 3:15 and then come back around 8 at night. And it's been like that for, I don't know, over 50 years. But nowadays, it's not like that anymore. Younger generations, including mine, would not devote so much time to lunch and then maybe have a nap afterwards. For better or for worse, I don't know. I wouldn't be able to live like my father, but apparently wouldn't be able to live like us either. And,
right. Yeah.
Well.
There's a lot of wisdom in that life rhythm. And it's one of the things that people are kind of, the wellness experts are really encouraging, even for the rest of us now, is to find a moment in the middle of the day when you can actually relax or do breathing or take a nap, something like that, because it really does restore you for the rest of the day. And for him, he's really just describing what people do, but he's advocating for that as well. It's just he's a lovely personality. I don't know what he was like in person, but he's a charming writer. So.
Yeah. Apparently he had many friends, but he never created his own family. Came from a family with an enormous amount of siblings. I think he had something like 12 siblings. So he came from this large family that, maybe we didn't say that, but moved from Emilia-Romagna to Florence due to certain financial hardship that they had to face at some point due to the seizure of the of the town he was originally from. And then he spent the rest of his life living by himself with a butler and probably someone who was cooking for them both. And then he died in by himself, but never alone, in the sense that he had a lot of friends and connections. So an interesting character, for sure.
Yeah, and you're reminding me also that the book is written in Tuscan, and he says this. And this is something that it wouldn't even cause anyone to bat an eye if they're not an Italian speaker or familiar with Italian linguistic culture, but that was a literary language for him. It was not a spoken language. And so he actually explains that he actually has a glossary that of terms, because he says to his readers, you might not all know this Tuscan language, so here are the words for these pans and utensils and other terms that come up in the book. And that's part of that history of unification. It's interesting that he was a transplant to Florence.
Yes.
And I don't really know the history of the book, whether he had an editor work with him to Tuscanize it, as so many authors did, or if it was possible for him to just write in Tuscan as well. I actually don't know.
I don't know either, and it would be interesting to find out. Maybe I can ask around some friends who are really into the history of this crucial book for Italian culture, and that has had so much success outside Italy as well. It is true that obviously writing not long after the unification of Italy, there was an issue with the language. I don't know how many in the audience know that Italian, as we speak the language today, was in a sense a literary invention. And there are texts in our culture that have helped establish the language of the Italian pretty much as we speak it nowadays. Before that, the country was divided from a linguistic point of view into many different dialects. And I still remember my grandparents that came from the same region and area as Artoozi speak the dialect quite often, at least amongst themselves. And I still remember some words, the word for kids, since I was one at the time, that sounds totally different from the Italian word for bambini, right? And it was burdel. Burdel. And it doesn't sound very good, but I still remember my grandparents talking about me and the other kids in the family referring to us by using that word. And so definitely it took a long time to overcome the use of dialect. In some regions, it's still very much spoken, and each region has its own dialect. There are some people who think that it's been a loss to see the dialects disappear, and some, even Italian artists or Pasolini and others who have praised the idea of going back more to these origins of the country, the culture, and the language. I don't have firm views on that. I don't know what you make of them, since you also have been studying and are studying figures from the Renaissance, and therefore you maybe study a language that in some sense is more connected to some of the dialects spoke, I don't know, around Mantua or other cities. How do you approach that part of the...
Well, that it was the 16th century that started that standardization move. And I think there's a lot of interest now in, for people who study Italian literature, as well as, people today who just are Italians. I think there's a sense that indeed something has been lost, but not entirely, and that it's okay to be multilingual. And, some of the most colorful things in the Renaissance were written in a kind of half Tuscan or not quite Tuscan. It's a very kind of mixed language because people they're straining, they're trying to rise to the occasion of a standardized language for publishing. It was really all about the publishing then. It wasn't about speaking, because people didn't really, my understanding is that people didn't really unify in the way they spoke until the days of the what do you call it? Obligatory conscription, the draft, which brought people together from different regions. And then after World War II, with the advent really of television, people were exposed on a daily basis to this standardized Italian, what in English might be the equivalent of BBC English or something. And so, and schools, it has a lot to do with the rise of literacy in Italy and the creation of a school system and obligatory schooling. So I find it really thrilling when I get to learn a word from dialect, or when I travel and I'm in a place. I used to spend a lot of time when I was younger in Trieste, and that's one of the cities where people really do still know the dialect and they speak it. So in order to get by at dinner parties and with my friends, I had to understand. I love the words. I love the grammar. I adore it. And I'm very pleased actually that there's music, there's hip hop music in dialects, especially in Naples and in Sicily. There's poetry coming back in dialects, and that people are kind of, interested, but it's a labor for them now. Somebody who's 15, has to actually learn about their parents' or grandparents' dialect. It's maybe seeping under the surface in kitchen terms or the word for kids or something, but not the whole language, and kind of complicated, but I'm all for the survival of those languages, because languages are dying every day. And Italy, super rich in languages. The Triestini, by the way, they call their children fiori, which for a long time I thought they were saying fiori, like flowers. But then I realized they're saying figlioli, but they say fiori. Where are the fiori?
Yes. Thank you so much, and I look forward to trying the biscotti.
Hi everybody. Today I'm going to make Italian biscotti, a favorite cafe treat, and I'm going to be sharing with you a recipe for chocolate-cherry biscotti and talking about two famous authors of Italian cookbooks, one from the 19th century and one from our own time. Now, biscotti, they're kind of everywhere, right? They're in cafes and grocery stores. You get them in those little cellophane things, but you can also make them at home, and you can make better ones than those expensive and kind of oversized ones that you generally get in the US. Italians call all cookies biscotti, but the traditional item, the one I'm making today and the one that we're talking about, the long guy, lives up to its name. It's twice cooked, biscotti, twice baked. They're made to last in a pantry and on a trip, and they're meant to be dipped, ideally, in wine or coffee or tea or milk. There also everywhere are Italian cookbooks, right? A huge industry feeds the world's love for Italian food. And so I'm going to put these two books in conversation today a little bit. The most important one is by someone named Pellegrino Artusi. It's called Science in the Kitchen and the Art of Eating Well. It's from 1891. Think of the two parts of that title, science and art. The science comes out in Artuzi's advice about health and nutrition, but the art is in the recipes and also in his writing, which is really delightful. Artuzi's book was important and is now a real classic of Italian cooking because it was the first book that was dedicated to cooking and eating in Italy as a nation. That might sound strange for the date, 1891, but think about it. We think of Italy as an ancient land of the Romans and the Etruscans, but Italy didn't really unify as a nation state until 1861. Before this, there was no Italian cooking, strictly speaking, because there was no Italy, strictly speaking. There was an Italian statesman named Massimo d'Azeglio who claimed after the unification of the peninsula into one state, he said, we've created Italy now, but we have to create Italians. And what he meant was that the people who lived in those 20 different regions of Italy didn't necessarily perceive a shared culture. They didn't perceive a national identity among themselves. Italy had in fact unified in order to fend off foreign invaders, but what did those people have in common with each other up and down that peninsula deep down? They didn't even speak the same language. They spoke many different languages, many more than those 20. So Artusi's book that was published when Italy was just a youngster nation of 30 years old helped to create that sense of imagined community, as we would say today, through shared foodways. Now, another important thing about Artusi's book is that he was not a professional cook, he was an amateur. His book is beloved because he wrote it for household cooks, people who might also lack the confidence in their own abilities. He talks at one point about how impenetrable the kinds of cookbooks that were written by chefs for chefs are, and he was writing a different kind of book. So he chats up the recipes, he tells us stories about them, he gives us coaching and courage, and he entertains us with gossip and health advice and funny stories. So this unassuming tone is just extremely winning in Artusi. He tells us, for example, about a nosy priest who is known as Don Pomodoro because, like the tomato in Italian cooking, he managed to get into everything. When it comes to meatballs, he assures us, do not think for a moment that I would be so pretentious as to tell you how to make meatballs. This is a dish that everybody knows how to make, beginning with the jackass. And then he gives us a simple recipe for meatballs. So it's true that some of the recipes are vague, kind of like the ones that your grandmother would give you or that you may have seen in your family files. They say, put enough of this in until this happens, or put as much of this in until it's enough. Artusi does rely in some ways on our intelligence and our inventiveness in the kitchen rather than giving us precise instructions for everything. That's not where the science is. That's where the art is in this book. He might send you to the dictionary even, or the philosophy books if you're reading in Italian. I remember first reading Artusi and I was confused when he referred to the souls of stone fruits. And then going to the Italian dictionary, I learned that an early use in Artusi's time was to speak of the pit or the stone in the stone fruit as the soul, the anima of the fruit. And so you have to remove the soul of the peach, the apricot, the cherry before you cook it or put it in your ice cream recipe. We can always look that kind of thing up on the internet, right? If you enjoy cooking or reading about food, I just recommend Science in the Kitchen as an appealing experience. You'll find in it not only the recipes and the stories, but also Artuzi's descriptions of how hard the book was to get published. He actually had to self-publish it because people thought, all the editors and publishing houses thought it wouldn't sell, and there was no reason to publish a book of recipes and talk about food. No one had confidence in this book. And that explains why the book also contains admiring letters from some of the intellectuals of the day, famous thinkers of the time, who appreciated it and wrote these really thoughtful little pieces about what it means to cook and what it means to bond over food. There's even a short comic sketch that he includes because it's a sketch, not because he includes it to describe a conversation between a host and his cook. And the host is telling his cook about all the different eating restrictions that his guests are going to have. And the cook ends up throwing his arms up in frustration and stalking off. Anyway, as my mother-in-law would say in one of her famous and favorite expressions, Artoozi has loads of personality, and it really comes out in the book. So I recommend it to you. There's a lovely English translation. The recipe I'm going to make today, though, is not from Artoozi. It's from one of his admirers. Michelle Ciccolone is the author of over 30 cookbooks, most of them about Italian cooking. You can find her online in YouTube videos and blogs and her many cookbooks. This is from a book called A Fresh Taste of Italy. There is a connection between these two authors. Ciccolone is not only a great cook and a fan of Artoozi, she wrote the foreword to the English edition of his book. And in that foreword, she has lovely things to say. She notes that while the recipes of Artoozi have mostly withstood the test of time, the real power of the book is its cultural power, because Science in the Kitchen has a status as a cultural classic, not just a cooking classic. It's a book that contributed to the project of nation building in Italy by cultivating unity through food. And that's something we can all appreciate, right? So here goes. What I have in this recipe, in this bowl, I'm looking at my book now, Ciccolone's book. I have flour and unsweetened cocoa powder and baking powder and salt. And in this bowl, I have, let's see, sugar, eggs, and vanilla extract. I'm gonna combine these and then I'm gonna add dried cherries to the whole mix, and that's going to be basically the recipe. There's no fat in here. Biscotti are generally low fat. They have sugar in them, but if you're looking for a semi-diet cookie or sweet, you could do worse than eating a biscotto. So we're going to mix this stuff up, and then the way that the biscotto takes its form is that I'm going to divide this dough into two big pieces, roll them out into a couple of long logs on this cookie sheet that I have next to me, and then I'm going to bake those as two logs. And when that baking is done, I'm going to pull out the logs, let them cool a tiny bit, and then cut them on the diagonal to make those kind of log things, those kind of long cookie biscotto shapes that you recognize from the thing that you eat from a bakery or from the store. Okay. It's kind of dry. Gotta really put a little muscle in here. That's the other thing about biscotti, they can be kind of dry as the dough. Okay. I think that might do it. Hang on, I gotta get a spoon. I'm back. Okay. Now, with kind of dampened hands, I need to form this dough into those two loaves. Divide it in half roughly. make this process work. This is kind of a fun thing to do with kids. You can handle the dough. They should be about 12 inches long. You can form them right on the cookie sheet lined with aluminum foil. Of course, this recipe will be posted. Now she says to form them 2 12-inch loaves. That's what I'm doing. I think chocolate and cherry is a great combination. They don't have to be perfect, you know, these are very forgiving. Kind of like an icebox cookie is when you make those and you just slice them up later. Okay, these are gonna go in the oven and I'll be back in a minute. So now I'm back. These logs that you see have baked for 30 minutes at 350, 355 in my oven. And I've pulled them out and I've already started slicing them. You want to do this while they're still warm and tender. I'm going to slice them into that shape that you recognize as the biscotto shape. This is the proper size of an Italian biscotto, not this. But anyway, these are going to go into the oven for another 10 minutes at the same temperature. And when they come out, what we will have is a wonderful batch of biscotti that we can dip into whatever we like or just eat them plain. Anyway, thanks.